So we'll go ahead and get started a little early, just in case people have questions at the end. I'm Dan Downs, Director of Digital Learning in North Reading Public Schools, and I'm with
James Burke, I'm the 7th grade computer science teacher in North Reading.
And we're presenting essentially on our work with doing a common assessment in digital learning. We're starting year 3 of our process. It's been a labor of love, but it's also taken a lot of time. So appreciate you all coming and joining us for the first session. And feel free, if you kind of have a question kind of in the middle of it, if you feel like you're going to forget it, it's okay to kind of probably ask it in a small group. So enjoy. So, of course, what are the benefits of implementing a common assessment in digital learning? I think we're all familiar with common assessments. Digital learning is kind of like the extra child that doesn't always get that attention. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, whether it's staffing or programs don't go all the way K-12. I'm very lucky in North Reading that we have enough people that we can cover K-12 and also realistically assess students consistently and have enough students to get an accurate, assessment. What are the barriers? I don't point to a ton of barriers within our experience. I feel like we dodged some barriers, and some of the barriers I think most people have is really around probably things they have in place, whether it's they don't have enough classes in 6th grade and maybe they're really strong K-5 and they don't have something they're strong in 9-12. So, but I encourage you, if you have a question about your own district, to ask, if there was a challenge with any part of what we were working on. Lessons learned. So I think we've learned some lessons, of things, especially with the implementation piece of things to avoid, things to work on and refine, and I'll show you some of that as we kind of go through. I do have a link to all the slides. I'll give you that in just a moment. So digital learning team, of course, committed to robust digital learning, development of skills and content understanding. We had 3 digital learning specialists at each school in the elementary. We have 3 elementary schools. They meet once a week with students. They get essentially 45 minutes of digital learning per week. We had one at every school. And we've done everything with that model, from rotate the specialists between schools to have them work in specific schools. We are still getting full K-5 by having specialists going between schools. In the middle school, with James will talk a little bit more, we have required computer science in grade 6 and grade 7. And we also have robotics in grade 6, 7, and 8. And we're hoping that we'll have required computer science in grade 8 soon. It's pretty much the question right now of whether or not what's going to happen with world language, because we have a heavy, world language. We added additional courses in world language, and it's the balance of student time and courses they can fit in. We wanted to utilize a common assessment curriculum that is separate than what students know it on the day-to-day. We have specialists. We've made tremendous investments in our program, and I felt like it was just time to show what everyone's learned, and put it in place and kind of be cohesive about it. I also felt that programs were changing. Teachers were teaching things different ways, different approaches, different resources, and we've had a lot of ability to kind of align those through digital learning grants, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But ultimately, there's a way of bringing our department together in a more cohesive way of looking how we were teaching and also how we were assessing students. So our goal essentially was to put in place a K-12 digital learning assessment, identify data that we could use moving forward, and a better understanding of the grade level content. It creates something that we can share with administrators, share with our community, share with across schools, what students are learning and how they're learning and how we're teaching. We did have a tremendous amount of support. This is a slide I kind of thought I needed to add after we kind of done the main one. We were a part of 2 large digital learning computer science. Those were tremendously helpful. I'll show you in a minute what those kind of brought to us as a broad view and a photo from a poster that Gussie made for us. It allowed us to do a scope and sequence, have more collaborative time with our specialists, upgrade course offerings, so we were able to add the AP principles in the high school as well as the regular CSA. We had that renewed focus around 7th and 8th grade. We had put the computer science in place, but those teachers didn't necessarily have the time to work together, the time to look at resources, talk about how they were going to teach it. So those grants were tremendously helpful at doing that and giving that kind of we're consistently upgrading robotics. We have a wide range of robotics platforms from VEX to B-bots in the elementary, middle schools, more VEX. So it also allows us to kind of get the robotics teachers to talk to our digital learning teachers, the ones who are teaching computer science, around what they're teaching in their classrooms that's related to computer science and programming robots, and also block-based programming that might do with robots, and how that relates to what they're doing in the classes and the program. And of course, professional development opportunities. So this was a poster that Desi made for us at every district, having posters around their work from the grant that kind of supported what they were doing through the grant. And so, we had, 5 schools, all of them have PLCS. It is required, which is fantastic. We were forced to make a vision, provide robust computer science instruction, both academic courses and co-taught learning blocks. A big part of this was the number of middle school teachers trained. We trained 8 teachers in the middle school. That's digital learning teachers, as well as science teachers and other teachers who wanted to participate in the grant. That also included some elementary teachers. We had 9 elementary teachers who were able to embed the Spiro robotics into the classroom with the support of the specialist. And then at the high school, we trained 1 teacher to implement the AP Principles course. And that was an AP course. Principles kind of has become an additional support to computer science in the high school, because at this time we're not able to kind of rearrange that whole system. As some of you may know, in high schools it can be very difficult with the schedule and the sequence and the requirements for students to take certain math or availability of electives. So the summer PD that some of our teachers did were the Intro to CS, Bootstrap Data Science, CS resources for K-5 educators, Learning to Code with Dash, Introduction to Cybersecurity, Make Code, Coding with Kibo, and Bringing Computation to Life with microbits. And we're big on microbits in the middle school. It's been a great kind of addition to kind of integrating with science teachers, and then also in the regular classroom.
When I started, it was my first year at teaching in general, and having all of that extra time to work with like grade level colleagues or other colleagues that are in the department, and actually be able to map out specifically what you were going to do year to year made the implementation of these other things much easier. Because if you're already sort of mapped out where your curriculum is going to go from year to year to year to year, designing an assessment that measures that is significantly easier. So just wanted to touch on that.
And there's a huge difference when James started teaching 3 years ago now.
Yes.
3 years ago, the computer science course and robotic course were not required. So, but we did have about 80% participation in those courses across the board, which was great. But now with that required piece, it really allows us to vision, all right, students are getting this, what should they be getting next? The mindset towards curriculum development can't be like a special, loose. It needs to be much more refined. So that time came in great handy for that kind of support. So when we started thinking about doing a common assessment, we thought about tiered vocabulary, align and balance DSE standards-based questions, developing a timeline and development and implementation for K-12. That's always a challenge because different roles are doing different things at different times. K-5 has their focus, 6-8 kind of has their focus, 9-12 could be, and I'll explain a little bit more from 9-12, it's a lot different, right? It's enhanced collaboration among staff who are working on it. I think that, at the end of the day, I'm probably more impressed with the work our staff did, kind of coming together, and the things that I heard them talking about when they were meeting around refining questions and talking about overlaps in curriculum. Then then even the student data at certain points, I'm like, boy, they're prepared. They've been teaching a little bit before, so they were kind of ready to kind of have these discussions because they weren't able to have those discussions before. Specifically, like issues like, what are we teaching in 5th grade? How is that different than what we're doing in 6th grade, especially with Scratch? Some people use that, continuously through, and they're not necessarily marking where students start, stop, and what they're expecting them to do in that classroom. And then also, with James's curriculum in 6th grade computer science, when do they actually start relay programming and writing scripts? Of course, with the data to review the progress, align our instructional practices with core concepts and standards, and of course, student learning growth and enhance department growth through cross-functional learning and teaching. So we spent a year just doing tiered vocabulary. So the tiered vocabulary process looked like, I had requested that our specialist review every grade level and basically make lists of words that are introductory, reinforcement, and then teaching to mastery. So having discussions around what level we're introducing the word algorithm, for example, what level we're introducing the word code. Very important conversations because they're all using them at different depths. And so what I wanted them to be able to do in year one was create very basic assessments at grade levels around how they were introducing specific vocabulary terms. And I have a folder of samples that we've created, so I'll share that with you in just a moment, just in case you want to kind of see that part, I have that. But that was incredibly beneficial to us, spending a year doing that, because I would say the tiered vocabulary tremendously helped us not only have cross-functional conversations, middle school, high school, elementary, around the language and the vocab, but then they were developing questions based on students' understanding of the vocab. And by doing that, they were also thinking about how they were teaching it and where they were teaching it, at what level and what resources they were using. So we did begin the process of developing goals to kind of match our work, and I'll show you a sample goal in just a moment. They all implemented assessments. They collected data on student performance on the tiered vocabulary. It also helped them review their instructional practices, because this was probably the first time that they discussed specifically about computer science vocabulary and had very targeted discussions like, I'm doing it this way in third grade at my school. How are you doing it in third grade at your school? Which is a really important question. And I spent time with them doing unpacking activities around CS vocabulary, and I can show you that as well in a folder I have that you can kind of poke around with on your own too. So basically the goal that year was implement assessment, review student growth and modify instruction, and of course develop curriculum for gap areas. So what we found probably with the tiered vocabulary perspective, if you're teaching one thing at an introductory level every single year, how are you scaling the knowledge around that, and how are you then assessing students on that? You know, what are the questions you're developing? And then utilize the collaborators. You know, all of this ended up helping our department grow, you know, in terms of understanding. And, you know, when they talk about common assessment, they always talk about that K-12 alignment piece, the top to bottom, tremendously beneficial. If you can get them in the room together.
It's not whether or not the word itself is a tier 1, a tier 2, or tier 3 in terms of how they're showing mastery. It's like, how are you using the word? So the word algorithm, as you said earlier, you can introduce it, you can reinforce it, and you can master it. So it's like the same word, has the same definition at all 3 tiers, but it's about how you're actually implementing the word into the curriculum and asking for the student understanding of that word.
There's always a lot of room for conversation with teachers between that, because when they start down that process, they all have their own idea of how they've been doing it. So sometimes they have to kind of backtrack, and then sometimes it's a resource issue. Maybe they've been teaching with a very specific resource which teaches it a certain way, maybe an online resource, and they kind of have to figure out a way to kind of make it more consistent with others. I had 3 teachers on this goal. My role with this process to try to make it happen was I wrote educator evaluation goals to try to be specific. And what I did was I encouraged my educators around this kind of process of implementing the assessment and doing step by step. So I wrote educator evaluation goals around how we were going to do it. And so in the process, I felt like we definitely, for all these steps, needed a lot of time. So between writing the goal and then dedicating the professional development time and the department time to working on the goals, my kind of approach and collaboration with my team was, let's take this goal on. This is directly attached to your practice, right? And it's going to be something that we can work on consistently. I'm not going to add new layers. Like I feel like sometimes with goals, you'll have 5 teachers, 6 different goals, and it can be very hard to kind of bring them together. So to kind of avoid that, I wrote the goals, and then I worked with them around the measures mostly. Most of them were on the same year plan, which was helpful. And then if they weren't on the same year plan, many were flexible around modifying their plan to kind of also have the collaboration piece and kind of have the outputs we wanted. So part of the student learning goal was to identify 5 to 10 key strategies per unit for improving students' comprehension of the vocabulary, and see at minimum a 25% increase in student comprehension in the post-test. These pre and post-test unit measures will assist me in identifying students' prior and depth of knowledge across my curriculum and assist in differentiated instruction strategies. And utilize the data-informed instruction to form a scope and sequence of CS and developing proper timeframes for units and content-based lessons. So select words, identify where we're teaching them, develop a measure, then implement it into your curriculum, and then collect data to see how your sequencing is, and does it make sense, and then does it make sense with maybe the people you're collaborating with. So the action steps, essentially the outcomes were updated classroom practices and updated scope and sequence, basically driven by the shorter assessments. The question and assessment focus, we spent a year discussing vocabulary, terms, how we were implementing them. Year 2 was solely focusing on developing the questions for the common assessment. So the goal was to develop a K-5, 6, 8, 9, 12 common assessment to measure student growth across the DESE digital learning standards. And I'll show you our spreadsheet on that. The outcomes, 9-12 digital learning entrepreneurship department reviewed their courses for a department-wide development of common assessment in year 2, question development and data collection for the common assessment implemented K-8. So in our year 2, K-8, we implemented our sample. We developed the questions, and then by the end of the year, implemented the assessment and collected data. Our high school department took a little bit of a different approach where I had all of those departments. The goals of the high school are a little bit different. They're about MTSS, tier intervention, and how that relates to instruction. So with high school, I had every course area develop 5 questions around their student learning. And the goal there is to ultimately use the common assessment data from the high school to understand student pathways related to computer science. And we're asking them what courses they have taken in the high school, and then to determine what their choices were once they got to high school, so in that middle school. So essentially the assessment asked them, what courses did they take in middle school? And then when they got to high school, did they choose to take the APCS? Did they choose to take a web design course? Did they decide to take an art course? What we're trying to get a handle on a little bit is student choice and selection once they get to the high school, because they do have a limited opportunity to kind of build on their experience after the middle school. And I'm of course using it as an opportunity to kind of argue for more integrated programming and computer science at an earlier level and reduce some of the prerequisites in 9th grade so that students can go from the required computer science in grades 6 and 7, get an 8th grade course, and then have something that all students who've had that experience can take when they're in 9th grade, so we can have a course, people want more AP access, things like that. So the high school is just kind of the tougher thing to crack. We use a lot of question development time, utilize the framework of standards, focused on question number of questions, focus areas, feedback on the questions, iteration and collaboration. Grade appropriate questions was a big kind of topic as we kind of moved through it. We definitely had to shift models between the tools we use for grade appropriate questions. And because of course one teacher teaching something at some level doesn't necessarily agree with the other, like around the content that they're teaching it or how we're going to assess them on it. And of course we did a gap analysis of the assessment at the end of the year. So this is the timeline of the year 2. Essentially, this was what I wrote for the goals. So each month we worked on a specific grade as a team during our collaboration time or professional development time. And also each month I asked the specialist to also provide feedback on their process with the questions. What's going on, how's it going, document their process, because what I was finding was the conversations were so rich between the specialists on what's happening in grade 4 around how we're assessing robotics in elementary, that I wanted them to have, I wanted them to eventually see that when we went back and did a gap analysis, because a lot of times if you meet in October about talking about grade 3 and you're creating an assessment and you're working on grade 5 3 months later, you're gonna forget what you thought of in 3 months later. So that was the important part of the month by month collection of data about their conversations to drive the assessment. So I've included both of these just so when you have the slide. So it's the same link. It was just more of a reminder for them that we really want, that process in place. And, I've kind of built in some team-wide data reviews in the middle of the year, January. September, October was the time we identified strand areas. So basically we took the strand areas and I asked them to identify a question from every strand area for the common assessment for each grade. And then also we worked on identifying a platform, whether it was Edulastic or Google Forms, and determine what would work best. Also the standards that could align to the questions, and then review potential gaps as we went along. And then we did 2 data reviews, one in January, and then one in May, and then ultimately May and June. Big times just to kind of bring everything together. And I had the researchers for that. My goal was also to have success with the common assessment and kind of map this process out and get it in place. James had that goal. Elementary specialists, 2 out of 3 of them had that, similar to that 90% goal. It was definitely a process that we were all committed to with the buy-in on it. And of course, implementation across all grades. And designing the goals took time, and we had to kind of nuance that. I would say that took into November to kind of nuance the goals where we needed them to be for each teacher. But it was definitely worth it because it kind of helped inform and kind of frame the conversations that teachers were having in the meetings. And of course, we had the tiered vocabulary to kind of build off the assessment. We're all meeting our goals, essentially. This is the digital learning goal for the actual assessment. During the course of the 2022-23 school years and the 23-24 school year, so it was a 2-year goal starting in 2022. The elementary digital learning team will develop a common assessment which will utilize vocabulary, relevant student data, content area gaps, and content area knowledge to be able to review the understanding of essential grade level digital learning and computer science knowledge by each grade. By the end of 23-24 school year, 90% of students across the district will show 50% growth on the digital learning grade level assessment. So essentially right now, we're already showing that kind of level of growth, benchmarked by our pre-assessment in most grades that we just took. And also James is gonna talk a little bit more about his experience with that. We looked at 2 different formats, and James is gonna speak a little bit more about these. You know, we utilized Google Forms where we needed to. Edulastic was great for data, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like. The free version was enough for us. I know that they offer more. I just wasn't ready to commit to the paid because I was more embedded in the process of like what our questions are, and as long as we could align standards with Edulastic, that was kind of like enough for me. With Google Forms, that became more of a grade level decision. You know, grades K1 and 2 were definitely better for Google Forms for some of the questions. It's easier for the students to navigate. But there's an additional analysis you might not get using Edulastic. This folder loads up. So I'll share the link out to this. Why don't I give everyone the link? Do you want to just talk a little bit about what your current role is?
Sure. So I am the 7th grade computer science teacher at North Reading, so at the North Reading Middle School. There's currently 6th grade and 7th grade computer science. I only do the 7th grade. Another teacher does the 6th grade. I've been there, this is my 4th year. Did not have traditional computer science experience when I came into the job, but like many teachers, I sort of learned on the job and figured out how to do all these different things, and I'm having a good time with all of that so far. So today we're going to talk about sort of just recap the whole process, because there's a lot of stuff that was just mentioned before, and then I'll give you a quick glimpse into some of the things and some of the philosophy behind how I designed some of the questions, and my colleagues and I designed some of the questions, I should say, and then sort of go from there. So do you have the...
Yeah, so this is the link. So this link takes you to like a link in bio for me through Bitly, and it will say MassQ presentation, and it'll take you directly to this presentation. I'll just give you a second. So it's basically it's a regular Bitly, but it has the before, and then it's just Digital Futures Education. How does everybody with that? James's slide.
So just to, I guess, recap the entire process, like briefly, we had the first sort of this introductory process with the grants, which is very useful to align the scope and sequence. We then sort of leveraged that into our first year of the goal, which was the tiered vocabulary goal. Again, building a really solid base of knowledge and sort of shared language and ability to communicate between grade levels and grade bands and all that different things. And then once we had that really solid base, we were able to come up with this goal for actually creating the common assessment. And the main benefit of having this set as an ed-eval goal, particularly as a grade level teacher, is trying to introduce this type of thing additionally on top of your regular teaching load if it isn't part of something that you have to do anyways. is kind of a big ask. So incorporating it directly into the department goal, or the eval goal, was a really useful thing for us, because it allowed us to leverage some of that department time that is already segmented and sort of allotted for this type of work to be used on that. And it's something that benefits the whole department, as well as our professional practice and all of those other different things, which is one of the main benefits there. So after we figured out the goals, we created that question bank, which you mentioned previously. And figuring out that question bank was really another really useful process, filled with a lot of great conversations. We sort of created the questions that we thought would be useful based on the main topics that we had decided on. Because frankly, you don't have like unlimited time in the classroom, and there are a lot of standards on the DLCS standard list. So you do have to like prioritize certain things that you find are the most useful, the most practical, and those sort of things. Ideally, you cover everything, but it's not always practical. So we identified which ones would be the most important, which ones would be the most representative of the types of sort of a fully fledged, fully formed curriculum. And we mapped those standards and assigned them to the questions in a big spreadsheet that we have that sort of helped us to design the actual assessment. Then we implemented our first draft of the test last year. I typically try to do projects with my kids. First version was not the best version, we'll say, but like anything, it's a learning process. There were some questions that were frankly just bad. Some questions that needed to be tweaked or sort of reworded, or maybe change the answers to be a little bit more difficult or easier based on feedback that we got from the students as well as our own observations. So the first draft was kind of a bust, but the second draft, after we were able to actually go back and figure out all of these things that went wrong, was much, much better. The kids had almost no questions on how to read. They didn't really understand what the question was asking. You need to really phrase it in a way that's accessible to students. And then we took that same second draft, made a couple small tweaks, and we implemented the pre-assessment for this year. I'll show you very briefly the data for that, but pre-assessment isn't too applicable without the post-assessment necessarily. Like it can help you identify a lot of things, but it doesn't give you the full picture until you know how the instruction has altered everything with that. So right down here is just a very brief snapshot of the median and average of the pre-assessment. So it's 58% and median 57% for students.
Pink is incorrect.
Yeah, these are questions. These are individual questions showing. This is on Edulastic, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But the red and green are showing the correct versus incorrect on specific questions. This circle, I guess, on the left is the one that's showing the actual score for the assessment as a whole. In terms of the implementation, Dan mentioned that we initially started out with Google Forms. That was particularly when we were doing the tiered vocabulary. It was just a lot of Google Forms, a lot of like smaller, like formative type assessments.